Hi, this is Jamie Madigan from the Psychology of Video Games.com, and I've got here a presentation that I recently gave at the Mobile Games Conference 2014 that I thought I would share with everybody. As I said, I'm Jamie Madigan, and I have a PhD in psychology, and I've always played a lot of games. So I write and talk about the overlap between those two subjects. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some psychological phenomenon that may be of interest to game developers, especially mobile game developers, specifically around how the framing of score, ranking, and comparison information can motivate people to play a game more or less or differently, just depending on what your goals are. So I grew up in the arcade. I was an arcade rat, the coin operated kind of arcade. And one of the greatest joys that I ever got to experience was getting my name on a high score list. And one of the greatest tragedies was seeing it knocked off by one of my friends. And so this practice really hasn't ever gone away. We still have scoreboards and score chasing and badges and achievements and trophies, the kind of thing that the high score list has morphed into over the years. But it's obviously gotten a lot more complex, and we can communicate a lot of different types of information. We can cut the information differently, and we can control how it's shown. We're much more sophisticated about that. So in psychology, we know that the way that something is framed can have a big impact on how people perceive that information and how they react to it and what judgments they make around it. So, for example, in prospect theory, we know that framing information about a medical procedure in terms of lives lost or in terms of lives gained can have a big impact on whether or not people will elect to undergo that procedure. Other areas, we know that if an appeal comes in the form of a story with a familiar narrative structure and characters, then people are going to be more receptive to it, and they're going to remember it, and they're going to believe it more often than if we just give them the same information in bulleted list form. And we know that people tend to remember information that's presented first or last in a list, and there's lots of other examples of this type of thing. So similarly, we know that the way you frame information about a game score or ranking can nudge players in terms of how they perceive it and how they make use of it. And I use the word nudge deliberately here. We're not talking about brainwashing. We're talking about subtle nudges of perception and use of information. But if you've got thousands and thousands of players, that can be a big deal. So I'm not a game developer. I'm not a businessman. So I have the good job of just being the idea guy in this presentation here. So what I'm going to do is review 3 psychological phenomenon behind how comparing ourselves to other players can motivate us to keep playing a game. And for each phenomenon, I'll suggest some things that you might want to try if you're a game developer or even a player. And my goal is to give you some solid ideas to tweak and test and experiment with. Maybe these things have been tried before out there in the field. Some of you may know better than I, but hopefully you'll be able to put a new spin on it and tweak it differently and get some results or do it on a different scale. So the first phenomenon I'll talk about today is called the related attribute hypothesis. And back in 1954, a famous social scientist named Leon Festinger came up with what he called the social comparison theory. And you may know Festinger from cognitive dissonance theory, which is another one that's sort of permeated popular knowledge. Same guy. But social comparison theory says that we crave information on our performance. Do I have a good job? Do I have good grades? Do I have a lot of points? Is my PvP gear good? And if we can't get that information objectively, we turn to social comparisons with other people. And so Festinger developed this theory, and he found that there are some very systematic, predictable biases about whom we want to compare ourselves against and how we go about making those comparisons. And for example, one of the things I identified was that we like to compare ourselves to people who are similar to us. His theory sort of fell short in taking it further than that. It didn't talk about similar to us in what ways or what ways were important. So subsequent researchers have sort of refined that idea and found 2 things. First is that we tend to compare ourselves and like to find a proxy to evaluate and estimate our own abilities when they are similar to us on some attribute related to the task in question. So in other words, we like to compare ourselves to people who are similar to us in some way that seems important to the task or the quality that we're trying to evaluate. This is especially true if it's an unfamiliar or a new task or an ambiguous task. So if I get a 9 on swing copters, a score of 9, for example. You may look at that and say, well, could I do that? And so the important questions become, are we both good at these types of games? Do we have good reflexes? Have we both been practicing the same amount? We have similar age. Are you a young whippersnapper and I'm an older person with sludgy reflexes? Have we gotten similar scores in other games in the past? And so forth. So the second thing that other researchers have found is that it's important for us to know that the person is trying their best. And in video games, this is usually pretty self-evident because we're usually trying to get the highest score that we can. So if there information about that related attribute is missing or not available, then we don't know much about the proxy and we're less motivated or we're less likely to use that person's performance as an evaluation or as a benchmark for our own performance, and we're much less likely to try to match that person's performance. So one study that looked at this by Martin et al. 2002, what they did was they brought people into a room and they said, we're going to have you do 2 tasks. First task is going to be to squeeze this little hand exercise thing, as many times as you can in 30 seconds. That's going to be task 1. So it's like the thing you see there on the left of the slide. And then after they're done with that, we're going to have you do task 2, which is to measure how hard you can grip this grip meter, like the thing you see on the right. It's going to measure how many kilograms of force you can apply. So task 1, task 2. But they said after you perform task 1, we're going to ask you to predict how well you might do on the second task. Now, the trick is that in one of the versions of the study, they gave subjects made up information on how well another person had done. So they said, in order to predict how well you can do on task 2, people tend to like to have some information about somebody else, like how well they did. And what they did was they gave that information. They said this person was able to exert so many kilograms of force in task 2, and they managed to squeeze the thing so many times in 30 seconds on task 1. But for some of the people, they gave information about this proxy's hand size. So for some, they said he had like Andre the Giant size hands that were 5 centimeters wider, and 5 centimeters is fairly significant if we're talking about hand size. For some people, they said this proxy has about the same size hands as you do, and for other people, they said this person has hands that are about 5 centimeters smaller than you. And of course, what they found is that people tended to use the proxy's information on task 1 to predict their performance on task 2 if their hands were about the same size and if they thought the person was trying their hardest. But in the case where the person had enormous hands, then they were much less likely to use that person's information on task 2 to predict how well they would do. And same if they had smaller hands. And there's been other studies along these lines where they looked at how much opportunity to practice a task a person has had, and they found that people tend to use a proxy to evaluate their own performance if they know that they've practiced the task about the same amount. So the takeaway here is that players are more motivated to compete against people who are similar to them, and more importantly, similar to them on something that seems to be related to the task. So some different things that you can try doing. This is all about lenses and filters that you can slice up the data with. We can crudely invoke the related attribute hypothesis by encouraging people to compare to themselves to those on their friends list. So you might have information about your friends, and the idea is that that'll invoke the related attribute hypothesis because people on your friends list, you're more likely to know information about them and information about a related task, how good you are at games, how old you are, so forth. But you could also take things further. And some other things you could try experimenting with are pointing out similarities with other players who aren't necessarily on a friends list, or even people who are on a friends list, pointing out information they may not necessarily have access to. Time that they played the game, the boosters that they've used, relevant demographic information about age and so forth, the device controller that they use, the person got this score, were they using a controller or were they using a touchscreen, were they playing the game on a phone, were they playing a game on a tablet, on a PC, etc. So, and we can activate that proxy model of social comparison to create rivals, provide information about where you rank against people in other games, provide information about how well you've done on those types of games, push information intelligently about what they've done. For example, when a friend installs a game, it could give them information like, "Hey, you just started playing this game. Your friend over here has played it, and on the first level, he got a score of 8 or whatever." And try to push that information intelligently and get people to try to compete with the right people. So the second psychological phenomenon I'm going to talk about is called the frog pond effect. This is often called the big fish, little pond effect, but I like frogs better than fish. I think they're cuter, so I went with the frog pond effect. And essentially, the frog pond effect describes how people who are ranked near the top of a badly performing group feel better about their performance than the people who are ranked near the bottom of a higher performing group. And I'll go through an example here in a second that'll make that clear. The other way that I like to sum this up is that sometimes all you need to do to make yourself feel like the smartest person in the room is just step into a closet full of idiots. And the point is that we don't make social comparisons to the larger world, like a global leaderboard, for example, when we have a chance to make them against a smaller, more relevant group, such as a friends list or a local leaderboard. And this is especially true if those comparisons let us feel good about our performance. And it's true even if the performance that earned you last place in the higher performing group is higher than the person sitting atop a pile full of morons. So one quick example of this, Team Fortress 2. I'm going to feel better about being the most valuable player on the losing team than I would feel about being the worst player on the winning team. True of any other competitive shooter as well. So the one study that I'll talk about, Zell and Alicki, what they did is they brought subjects into a room, and they 10 at a time, and they split them, or they said, we're going to have you perform this task where you watch a videotape of a bunch of people making statements, and your job is going to be to figure out which one of them is lying. So you'll watch X number of people making statements, and you'll say that person's lying, that person's telling the truth, etc. So the plot twist here, though, is that the only liars involved were the psychologists. And I've said it once, I've said it a million times, psychologists are pathological liars. If you ever find yourself in an experiment, you're probably being lied to. So what they did was that they gave subjects bogus feedback about their performance. So one at a time, they brought them in after they completed this task of trying to pick out the liars, and they said, your performance on this task placed you 5th out of 10 out of all the people who were doing it alongside you. And most of the time people were like, well, that's fine, 5th out of 10, I feel okay about that. That was a weird task, I wasn't really sure who was lying or not, so I wasn't sure how well I was doing, so 5th out of 10 is okay. I'm not ecstatic, but that's okay. But what they also did in a separate condition is that when they brought people into the room to do the task, they split them into 2 groups of 5. So 10 people, 2 groups of 5, say the red team and the blue team. And then when they brought people back in to give them their individual feedback, they said, your performance, you were on the red team, your performance put you 5th out of 10 overall, so just like the people in the other condition, but you were 5th out of 5 on your team, on the red team. And so the only thing that was different here is that the people were split into 2 teams, and the person was given the exact same overall feedback of 5 out of 10, 5th place out of 10. But these people had lower self-esteem, they were less happy with their performance, they were less motivated to try to perform similar tasks, yet the only thing that was different was the fact that they were put in a smaller pond and given a lower rank. So, the takeaway here, and by the way, this is my favorite slide of the entire presentation, is that larger groups make it less likely that a player will feel good about his or her performance. So larger groups make it unlikely that a player will be able to compare themselves against people in a way that makes them feel good. There's can only be a few big fish in a big pond, but if you break the ponds up, suddenly people feel like bigger fish or frogs or whatever it is your water-based animal of choice would be. The common example of this usually gets batted around is the valedictorian of a small high school, who's the smartest person at his or her school, graduate with honors, used to being the smartest person around. They get into a competitive university and suddenly they're surrounded by people who are at least as smart and capable as they are. And so that person may have motivational problems of, they may want to change to an easier major or drop out of school or not be motivated to study as much when they're no longer setting the curve in the class. Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about this specific example in his latest book, David and Goliath. So some things that you can try. Everything from the related attributes hypothesis that we talked about, breaking people into smaller groups and sort of segmenting that data will activate the frog pond effect. But some other things that you can do is to give players information about things that are not necessarily related to a related attribute, but really anything. So you could give geographic and demographic information, the number of kinds of games that the person has played. You can split things out and talk about people who use this particular weapon. You're ranked in the top 10%. People who play this particular class or use this particular skill. Number of people who have played the game for so many hours in the last month. You're in the top 5% or 25%. So you can do all kinds of little cuts of data like this and find meaningful ways to present it in a way that allows the person to be at the top of a smaller group. You can find different quick hits or stats like badges and achievements that separate people out instead of relying strictly on leaderboards or scores as well. So you can say, you scored 1,000 critical hits with that weapon. That puts you in the top 10%. You can say, all kinds of things like that. This is not the same thing as just giving a giant data dump or a wall of achievements like we've seen in some games. The framing component is critical here, so you have to try to nudge people's comparisons towards a group that motivates them to keep playing, some sort of relevant group, and not just like a global leaderboard or a count of the number of things that they've done that is independent of any comparison with other people. So the question then comes of, well, what happens when you get to the top of a group and then you sort of become in danger of falling out of that top position? Or worse, what happens if you, like the person in the previous example I gave about the experiment, get in danger of falling into last place? So that is the second phenomenon the third phenomenon I'll talk about, which I call the Michaela is not impressed effect. There's probably a more scientific, psychology-y sounding name for this, something to do with loss aversion maybe, but I like the name because Michaela Maroney, the young woman you see in the photo here, really exemplifies it so well. So Maroney's a better gymnast than you, than me, than anyone you know, and probably anyone that you could name without doing a Google search. Just 16 years old, she helped her team win several gold medals in the 2012 Olympics, but she's sort of best known as being the girl who was dissatisfied and disappointed with winning second place in one individual competition. So during a run at a vault horse, she choked on her last run, and she ended up falling down as a result, and that mistake cost her the gold medal in that individual event. And then when she went up on the awards stage to get her medal, you can't see it in the picture here, but she's wearing a silver medal, she made this face, as if to say, I am extremely unimpressed with this silver Olympic medal that I happen to win. And sort of it turned into this whole meme, Michaela is not impressed meme, where people photographed or photoshopped her being unimpressed with various otherwise impressive things like, the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wall of China or a tiny horse or whatever it may have been. And in fact, there's research to show that Maroney might have been more satisfied with winning bronze in that particular event, at least in that moment. Some researchers at Cornell University once trained raters to rate the facial expressions of various Olympic medal winners in the 1992 Summer Olympics. And so they watched videotapes of people up on the awards stand, and they rated individually how happy each person looked. And they found that, of course, the gold medal winners looked happiest for all the obvious reasons, but they found that the bronze medal winners tended to look happier than the silver medal winners. And that's because when you make a bronze medal, when you win that medal, you're making downward social comparisons. You're looking at all the people who didn't even win any Olympic medal, who can't legitimately call themselves Olympic medal winners, and they're thinking, hey, this is pretty great. I'm glad I'm up on the stand. I didn't win gold, but I came really close to not winning anything at all and not being an Olympic medal winner at all. Whereas silver medal winners tend to make upwards comparisons with the gold medal winners and say, I came really close to being the best of the best in a category of in and of itself, and I'm happy with that, despite the fact that being up here is pretty impressive in and of itself. So one study that looked more into this sort of, they didn't call it the Michaela is unimpressed effect, but I do. Garcia from University of Michigan did a study where he had people role play a bunch of different things, including like a executive at a Fortune 500, a CEO at a Fortune 500 company, or a player in a high stakes poker tournament. And so he said, imagine, he went to the experiment, to the subjects, and said, imagine that you were in a situation where you're able to cooperate with another person, a competitor, so another CEO or another player in the poker tournament. And if you take this opportunity to cooperate, your winnings or your profits are going to go up by 10%, guaranteed. Promise, you'll guaranteed a 10% increase in your winnings or your earnings if you cooperate with this person. The catch is, though, that person is going to benefit more from the deal, and their winnings or their earnings are going to go up by 25% instead of 10. And it's going to change your standings. And he found that people usually refuse to cooperate, refuse to take this deal, if taking it meant that they would fall out of first place or if they would fall into last place. So if it meant from moving from first to second, they wouldn't take it. If it meant from moving from second to last, they wouldn't take it. But for the subjects who were told, like, you're 402nd in the rankings, or would you take the deal? Almost all of them took the deal, did the rational thing, took the deal, guaranteed 10% increase. They didn't care if it meant moving from 402nd to 403rd or what have you. So those milestones matter. Another study that looked at this looked at 2.5 million putts that were attempted by professional golfers in the PGA between 2008 and 2004. And so they had information about elevation and slope and distance from the hole, and so they were able to statistically control for all this and just looked at how accurate the putters were on each one of the holes. And they found out that even for controlling all of those things, these professional golfers tried harder and were more accurate on putts that let them score par than they were on putts that let them score under par. So in other words, when they were in danger of missing par on a job or going over par on a hole, they were more careful, they put more effort into it, and they were more accurate as a result. This is totally irrational because they should be putting as much effort and being as accurate as they can on every single stroke in these tournaments, because a single stroke can often mean the difference between first and second place. It could often mean the difference between tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in winnings. The margins are very small that separate the players in the rankings for these tournaments. But there was something about going over that standard of par on that hole that motivated these professional golfers to be more accurate and to try harder. That's even though it's totally irrational. So the takeaway here is that not all rungs on a tournament ladder are equally spaced. Michaela Maroney's presumed reaction is emblematic of this fact, and the difference between first and second place is much bigger than the difference between second and third place. The only, thing that is also true, pair of rankings that are also true in that way, would be last place and second to last place, or if your game or your tournament has some sort of meaningful goalpost or some meaningful standard like par has in golf, of going over par or hitting par, going under par, is going to be really meaningful as well. So some things to try. Here's Miss Maroney again. She's much happier. Perhaps she had information about her performance framed differently. You can try creating more first places, opportunities for people to be first place. First in gear, first in wealth, most efficient, quickest time, etc. You can use push notifications intelligently to make sure that people know when they're about to fall out of first place or they're about to hit last place or pass some other meaningful milestone. That may also be a great time to offer to sell them a coin doubler or an experience points booster or some other sort of power up if you're into that thing. It would be a good timing for that sales pitch. But letting players know when someone is nipping at their heels, especially around those meaningful milestones, is more likely to motivate them to pick up the game and try another run, or to improve their score, or to get more of whatever it is that's going to put them out of danger of losing that ranking. Got to use this sort of stuff sparingly. It's only going to be really meaningful when you're talking about those meaningful milestones: first place, last place, par. But I think it could be pretty powerful if you do it. So that's what I have. Hope you stayed through for the entire thing and enjoyed it. Here's a few different ways to contact me if you try any of this sort of stuff. I would love to know how it goes. You can go to psychologyofgames.com to read more about this information. And this presentation was actually adapted from a chapter of a book that I am writing and that will be coming out soon, that is on the same topic. And so you can go to the website or write me at that email address, or visit me on Twitter at Jamie Madigan to find out more. Thanks.